Well, hello everybody. My name is Brianna McWilliam, and I am a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist, author, and educator. And I help adults struggling with insecure attachment go from feeling self-doubting to self-sovereign and calling in those soul-shaking, passionate partnerships that they want. And today I am so excited because we have a wonderful guest presenter, Dr. Usha Tummala-Narra, who has agreed to join us here today to talk about the impact of cultural competence and intersections of oppression as it pertains to our attachment styles and relationships. And to give you a proper introduction, Dr. Tummarla-Narra is a professor of counseling, developmental, and educational psychology at Boston College. She's also in independent practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her research and scholarship focuses on immigration, trauma, race, and cultural competence in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. She has served as the chair of the Multicultural Concerns Committee and member at large on the board of directors in American Psychological Association Division 39, Psychoanalysis, and as a member of the APA Committee on Ethnic Minority Affairs, the APA Presidential Task Force on Immigration, and the APA Task Force on Revising the Multicultural Guidelines. Dr. Tummarla-Narra is an associate editor of the Asian American Journal of Psychology, associate editor of the Psychoanalytic Dialogues, and senior psychotherapy editor of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. She's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and with APA Division 39 and Division 45. She's the author of Psychoanalytic Theory and Cultural Competence in Psychotherapy. This one, y'all need to go out and get it. And this is by APA Books. This was published in 2016, and her forthcoming edited book, Trauma and Racial Minority Immigrants, Turmoil, Uncertainty, and Resistance, will also be published by APA Books in January 2021. So I am very excited and happy to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Brianna. Nice to be here.
So I want to transition into asking maybe a few more specific questions. And these were questions that were posed by my online community. When I told them that I was going to be able to interview you, I asked what they might be curious about. And so these are just a few of those. So the first question is, do concepts and expectations of love and how it is expressed vary cross-culturally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what we say, how we describe love affectively, I think feels very similar, at the heart of it, at the core. But I do think outward expressions of love can look very different. In some contexts, it's interesting because I was born in India and immigrated here. And when I look at the Indian context, oftentimes, certainly back when I was, a younger person, a young girl in India too, in those days, but I think it's true even now to some extent, that it's far more acceptable to show your affection towards young children, even people of the same sex versus people of the opposite sex, that there's a more reserved nature, particularly as one moves out of childhood and adolescence into adulthood, to show more of a reserved, type of approach, or use more of a reserved type of approach when you show that love towards someone else, particularly romantic love, that is seen as something that should be reserved for a more private space rather than a public space. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes you will see men holding hands and walking on the street versus men and women holding hands. And now you see far more of both, actually. So which in the United States, in this context, it's usually the opposite. And people assume that if two men or two women are holding hands, that this is a sexual relationship or a romantic relationship rather than a friendship. So I certainly think the ways in which people express their love towards each other, their affection towards each other, varies across cultural contexts. And a lot of that is shaped based on broader cultural thinking and cultural norms around privacy and a sense of collectivism and community versus individual expressions of affect and emotions.
Sure. So another question that I have for you is, how strong of an influence do you feel gender roles still have cross-culturally?
I think gender roles play an enormous role in all societies, as far as I know. There, as much as I think we have made progress in many cultural contexts with regard to, you know, um, more acceptance of variations of gender expressions and gender roles. I do think there's a lot of messaging, certainly within the US and in other places around the world, that, girls carry certain qualities and do certain things, and boys do other things and carry other qualities. So I do think that um, young people and children, adolescents in particular, receive a lot of mixed messages about that, about um, individual choice and autonomy around gender roles versus ultimately what might be more acceptable to the people around them, and even in many cases, the people that they love. And so when you are invested in a relationship and maintaining a relationship, you're also more likely to take those messages more seriously and internalize those messages to a greater extent.
Sure. And another question that came up was, how does culture intersect with technology to affect our attachment styles in your perspective?
Well, I think that technology and, you know, um, the online world of intimacy has taken off, as we all know, globally. I think this is not specific to any cultural context, but I do think there are ways in which culture and cultural norms and values shape people's perceptions of what they're seeing online. And how they interpret their interactions with others, how they experience their interactions with others, their choices of, when I think about the online dating, for example, and how people start to think of the people that they want to seek out and are interested in. And I think all of the same non-digital, non-technologically, involved issues around attachment get played out on the internet, get played out online, and people are seeking some of those same qualities in others that they would otherwise offline. And so there is, and I think there's a lot of, I do want to mention that there are clients that I work with who tell me about the kind of profiling and the stereotyping that also, takes part in that perception of other people online. And so I think sometimes the online world obviously can offer a lot of different opportunities, access, which is wonderful, to all kinds of connections. And yet, at the same time, it does not mean that we're not also filtering what we express to others and filtering what we hear from others based on stereotyping around race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. And so my clients do talk about this quite a lot. The other thing I'll say about technology is that, if we're not thinking about internet and we look at our phones and texting, there are a lot of times that clients will talk about how long should I wait before I text somebody back, And so you get this question a lot, right? So it's this, this wondering about the self in relation to others, and the anxiety that's produced in this type of interaction of not knowing and not being able to see and be with that person to kind of read other cues. And so you spend a lot of time guessing, and sometimes that anxiety can spiral out of control. And there are times when I've asked my clients to just simply stop texting for, a certain period of time because of that, and see how that affects their sense of self and their feelings, their anxiety and all of that. So I think there's a lot to explore when it comes to technology, and there's a lot more to be said about it.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to start. Thank you. I only have two more here.
Sure.
The first one is, What about arranged marriages? Do you feel that arranged marriages would impact someone's attachment style or the way they would play out?
Hmm. I think arranged marriage in the contemporary context has a lot of different forms, and that's important to recognize. So there are some arranged marriages that are still very much determined by parents or other caregivers, relatives, um, friends of the family. There are other types of arranged marriages, however, that involve far more autonomy and decision making of the two people involved. And so uh, they do, I think it depends on how the family sort of handles and approaches the process of arranged marriage. And I think that when a person has um, a what they feel is a reasonable amount of autonomy and decision making power, that they often find themselves feeling as though that they have more control over what goes on with their relationship, or they feel as though they do. There are other situations, however, when a person hasn't gotten to know the other one, the partner very well, then certainly this can cause a lot of anxiety, and so I would say that's what's unique about arranged marriages. And the theory behind arranged marriages is that you get to know someone first as a friend before you fall in love or before you develop those romantic and sexual feelings. And so the course of it, in terms of romantic love, is different than how we tend to conceptualize it here.
Mm-hmm.
Where romantic love precedes everything else that comes after it. So, the direction of things is different. But I do think that whether it's an arranged marriage or not an arranged marriage, and it's, you meet somebody because you've dated them and on your own, you still carry the early attachment styles with you, and those are going to interplay with that individual and their attachment history as well, and certainly also trauma histories. So yeah, so I think that there's some unique qualities to it, but I don't think that determines everything either.
Right. And I just wanted to comment a bit on what you were talking about the sort of Western view of romantic love as being the sort of, the antecedent to everything. And it made me think of what you were talking about before about how that there's some difficulty in making a distinction between romantic love and love, and or filial love, or another
Mm-hmm.
type of companionable love. And there's I maybe this is just in my observation, but there seems to be a way that we value one over the other, and that culture plays a role in that too, it seems.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great observation. There's another example of it comes up when we conceptualize parent-child relationships when the child has become an adult. And there's a lot of questioning, I think, traditionally in psychology about how often should you talk to your parent when you go to college or when you become a young adult, and what determines your individuality and your autonomy. And for a lot of people, it's not determined by how much contact they have. In fact, they would like to have that contact more frequently. It's not something that should necessarily be interpreted as enmeshment or something pathological, or that the person is incapable of individuating, but it's more that it happens in a different way. Individuation happens at different points perhaps in the person's life, rather than at one specific point that we kind of tend to equate with, turning 18 and becoming an adult, which is kind of an arbitrary time, really.
Mhm.
So, so I think your point to me brings up how and which types of love we tend to value over others, and what we think they're markers for a person's development.
Yeah. That I like the way you said that. What are they markers for? You know, because it's how we are ascribing meaning to our experience, right?
Yes.
And I had one more question for you. And this question is, how do beauty standards in different cultures influence love relationships?
hmm This is a great question. I think that beauty standards have a tremendous role in what is considered to be desirable and attractive and valued. And so I had referenced earlier in this case of Amaro, um, the issue of skin color. And that is one example, but there are many other indicators around beauty standards: skin color, hair texture, the shape of one's eyelids, body shape, all of these things are things that are, there are standards within communities that I think get upheld in sometimes very destructive ways. And young people, children are internalizing those standards, and who they think they are, where they think they fit along those standards, and also who they might choose in their partner based on those standards. Relating this back to the online issue, I know that there are, on online sites, there are, in profiles that will indicate, no uh, Asians or no, X, Y, and Z group because of their stereotypes. And those stereotypes sometimes are based in these beauty standards that we're socialized with.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, this has a damaging effect on the ability to be in a relationship with, people, be open to relationships with people from all backgrounds. But also, I think it constrains how one sees themselves, that they have to sort of stay within that standard in order to be valued and desirable themselves. And who they choose as a partner becomes a reflection of that sometimes. So beauty standards, I think, have an enormous impact. And unfortunately, they perpetuate a lot of stereotypes that we're, as a society, still grappling with.
Sure. Um, and I actually have one last question for you.
Or,
And that would be if you had any guidance or advice for someone who is in an intimate relationship or wanting to be in an intimate relationship, and they also want to be approaching the subject of cultural competency and inclusivity, and if they have partners who are struggling with intersections of oppression, would you have any guidance for them on how to approach the topic? Or if there's someone who's experienced intersections of oppression and they want to approach that with their partner, do you have any guidance on how they should approach that?
yeah, I think, in any kind of relational work, it's important to deeply delve into one's history, right? And this is one's personal history. And sometimes our personal history taking doesn't always include questions around culture, context, and it's not typical for, for instance, in intake assessments that we ask questions about race and culture and context. So I do think it's important, just like a number of years ago, we started including questions about trauma and experiences of trauma. But we've sort of limited our inquiry about trauma into things like sexual assault or abuse, violence, maybe combat trauma, these types of traumas. But far less so do we ask our clients about racial trauma, political trauma, the trauma of immigration or dislocation, things like this. And yet those traumas shape us, they shape our experience. And so to me, it's really important for, those of us who are in that helping position to inquire about that, to initiate conversations about that, and sometimes even educate our clients, their partners, about the role of those specific type of traumas on a person's life, you know, and because everybody is sort of socialized to think that these things shouldn't bother them so much, right? So how many times do people seek out therapy to cope with racial trauma, post-colonization stress, right? Not those are not the known reasons. People seek help because they might be depressed or anxious, or they're having relational conflicts, things like this. But by and large, we have to educate our communities that, in fact, this is a source of stress that is valid to talk about and to explore its impact on one's life.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your willingness to share your wisdom and your expertise with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Yes, and I would just invite anybody who is watching this interview, if you would like to comment below with your thoughts, reflections, or even more questions, that will also give us more information and direction to go in moving forward. So thank you so much, and I appreciate your coming.
Thank you so much. Take care.